Here is a broken 2018 Honda CBR 1000RR. And here are all the broken parts I've spent the last week stripping off of it.
There's not much left, but that's all part of the plan. I didn't hesitate to buy this crashed CBR when it popped up on auction, because it was going for just $3,000, about 75% less than a bike like this would normally sell for.
You know, minus the crash damage.
Since then, we've uncovered most of the drastic damage, like the bent forks, destroyed subframe, and a hole in the swing arm.
But you see, when I crunched the numbers before buying this bike to see if it was financially possible to rebuild, there were two major areas that could absolutely not be damaged.
Number one, the engine. And as you know, that started badly. Literally, the bike wouldn't even start. But after a bit of troubleshooting and an eventful moment,
Holy sh**.
I finally got it running, or vaping, I'm not exactly sure.
And number two, the frame, because an impact big enough to bend the forks could also damage the frame. And although visually it looks fine, I've since learned that there could still be a lot of hidden damage. So it needs to be inspected, hence why the bike now looks like this.
I've got a plan for all of the damage I've unearthed on this bike so far, like the subframe, the swing arm, the stay bracket, the handlebars, and so on.
The only damage I'm not quite sure how to tackle just yet are these bent forks, but I figure a good place to start is to get them off the bike, dismantle them, and then we can see what's damaged inside of them and go from there.
The first step was to get the weight off the forks. I thought I'd see how far I could bend this paddock stand spool back before breaking it, and it was rather effective. However, I didn't have the right size adapter to get my triple clamp paddock stand to work. And even after making my own spacers out of piping, it was off the ground, but still a little unstable.
I'm going to have to get these clamps off at some point as well to see if they're straight, and so that I can get a better look at the headstock of the frame. So I'm going to need a better solution than this stand.
I figured the frame sliders were a safe point for jack stands, but mine were considerably too short. So I had to make some sturdy risers out of wood to get the extra height. And then I could gently jack up the bike, slide the stands under the frame sliders, and slowly lower it back down while keeping an eye on things. With the weight now off the forks, I could turn my attention to anything attached to the forks, like the brake calipers, wheel speed sensors, and finally the front wheel itself, which we will also need to inspect for damage later on. Then the forks are super easy to get out, with just 2 pinch bolts on the lower clamp and 1 pinch bolt each for the clip-on and top clamp. The right leg practically fell out, but the left one required a bit of convincing.
You can also see the damage to these forks a lot more clearly now that they're off of the bike. You can actually see wrinkling in the back of the bend in the stanchion here. The bends are also a lot more similar to each other than I thought. On the bike, it really looked like the right fork leg was a lot worse off. But having the bends symmetrical is probably a good thing. It means that they will have absorbed the impact together, helped to share the load. It also means that they applied the forces further back to things like the triple clamps, the steering stem, and the frame a lot more evenly, making our chances better, hopefully.
The extent of my suspension work stops at adjusting the clickers. So I had a YouTube video on hand to show me how to work on these Showa BPF, aka big piston forks, which require specialty tools like this top cap remover and this funny thing to remove a ring inside the slider. At the time, I had great intentions. I even made this janky holder for my vise so I didn't damage the forks. But I was actually just wasting my time, and $100 on those tools. According to my guide, the first step was to remove the top caps. I'd actually loosened them earlier on while they were still clamped in the bike to make things easier, but they weren't very tight at all. Next, I had to slide the stanchion up inside the slider to be able to completely remove the top cap from this rod. And then I could remove these two rods that are responsible for compression and rebound. But this is where my experience deviated from the video. I couldn't see the ring that I needed to loosen, so I poured a bit of the oil out to get eyes on it, but it was still too deep to reach.
So apparently I overlooked a very small detail when it comes to dismantling forks. In order to do it like the video suggests, you need a straight fork leg, which I don't have. So because of the bend in the stanchion here, I can't lower the slider enough to get to the ring inside that I need to loosen to continue dismantling it. And to be honest, I don't have the tooling or the patience to try and straighten the stanchion enough to lower the slider. So instead, I'm going to take it to a professional so that I don't damage it any more than it already is.
In order to bend forks like this, the bike either had to rear end a car or slide into something front wheel first.
And unfortunately, that means that the forks weren't the only parts to experience the impact. It could also have been dispersed through the front wheel that's sitting over there, through the triple clamps, through the steering stem that goes between the two clamps, or even the frame itself. And any of these components could now be bent as well. And these are more difficult to see visually than the forks were.
This play in the steering is the first clue that something isn't right. Best case scenario, it's just a bearing, and worst case, the frame is ovaled where the bearings sit. The steering damper then needs to be disconnected before we can remove the clamps, as well as the horn on the bottom clamp. And then I got to use my new 41mm wrench to loosen the steering stem nut, and the top clamp just wiggled off without any fuss. The ignition cylinder has two wires running to it, both of which go to the same connectors on top of the airbox that I played with extensively to get the bike running. Underneath the top clamp, there's another nut that has metal tabs to stop it from backing out. But once I bent those back, it was just finger tight. Luckily, because I don't have the special C-spanner required. But then I got to the real challenge. There's this black lock nut that also needs a special tool from Honda, and it wasn't just finger tight. Of course, I went down the traditional screwdriver and hammer route instead, trying to be gentle at first so I didn't damage it, but no matter how many times I hit it, it wouldn't loosen. And this was the next sign that something was wrong. These threads are severely damaged. Over the course of the next hour, I eventually got it off, but it will never be the same again. And just like that, the bottom clamp slid out. Then I removed the bearings and cleaned the grease off of everything so it's easier to spot any damage.
The good news is that I found the reason for the play in the steering stem. It felt exactly like when the bearings are bad. You know that feeling of when you pull the front brake lever, rock the bike back and forth, and there's play in the steering stem.
The forces obviously tugged on the lock nut, stripping the threads on both the steering stem and the lock nut, which loosened everything up, resulting in play. And then I abused the nut even more to get it off. The bearings might feel fine, but I did find a crack in the outer race on the top bearing.
I suspect it's better for these threads to strip, absorbing some of the impact, than for more parts to bend though, right? So now let's play a game I like to call Is It Bent?
The stem itself looks perfectly straight, with the gap to a straight edge staying consistent all the way around and perpendicular to the clamp, so I declare it straight.
I'm not sure if I will be able to get just the stem itself replaced, or if I'll have to get a whole second-hand assembly like this, but we do need a fix of sorts for both the threads on the stem and this lock nut.
The lower triple clamp doesn't appear to be bent either. It sits flush everywhere it should on a flat surface, as does the top clamp, neither of which have any cracks or signs of stress, and ultimately have been declared straight. The front axle endured the same thorough testing endorsed by NASA, T's and C's apply, and also got declared straighter than Jigsaw riders.
Measuring a car chassis to see if it is straight looks a lot easier than a bike frame. A car chassis is relatively square, so you can measure from point to point and see if it is symmetrical. But a bike frame is more tricky.
First, I wanted to make sure that where the bearings sit in the neck of the frame wasn't ovaled by the steering stem during the impact, but the diameter was consistent all around, top and bottom. I then tried to measure from point to point on the frame, using bolts and markings that are symmetrical on each side, to see if it's shifted to one side or the other. The frame hasn't pulled away from either of the engine mounts, and I've spent hours looking everywhere for cracks or discoloration.
I am definitely not an expert at this, but at least one of these measurements should give me a hint if things aren't straight here. The other method you could use is to measure if the wheels align with each other. Then you could get an idea of if the headstock is tweaked at an angle or not. But for that, you need the bike to be on its wheels with straight forks.
So for now, it's declared plausible until we can measure the wheel alignment, but I'm at least confident enough to continue.
When we got the bike started, it was smoking profusely. Obviously, it was burning off the oil inside the cylinders, but I also think that there is oil in the exhaust system that is adding to the smoke, because every time I come back to this bike, there is a fresh puddle of oil right underneath this joint in the exhaust pipe. Combine that with its hideous rusty appearance, I think the best move is to just take the whole system off and clean it inside and out.
To get to the header bolts, the radiator needs to be out of the way. So I started by zip tying all of the dangling calipers and handlebars up out of the way, and then went to drain the coolant. Except this bike is so filthy and covered in chain wax that I couldn't even spot the drain bolt at first. But after giving it a scrub, it looked about the same, so I went ahead and drained the coolant anyway. Interestingly enough, the radiator popped off one of its mounts in the crash, but this mount isn't even threaded, so there must never have been a bolt to begin with. Also, the tire rubbed the headers in the crash, which shows the potential of these underneath all the rust. The radiator was trickier than I expected. The hoses have these single-use hose clamps that I've never worked with before, and the only way to remove them seemed to be to cut them. The left radiator hanger also had a bracket for brake lines that needed to be removed, but then finally I could disconnect the fans and remove the radiator, revealing the header bolts we're after. Next, I could remove the very real, not at all fake SC Project exhaust and loosen off all the header bolts, only to realize I'd forgotten the O2 sensor. Amateur. Once outside, the oil continued to pour out, so I decided to deal with that first, by zip tying a garbage bag over one end of the pipe to seal it, pouring fuel in the other end, and sloshing it all around. After all, nothing breaks down oil as well as fuel does. And I repeated the same process on the headers, although they were a lot messier since they have a lot more holes. Then I moved on to the rust. I lathered up the headers with Harpic toilet cleaner and let it sit for a few minutes to eat away at the rust. I came back with a Brillo pad and went to town on the rust, trying to get into all the grooves, and slowly but surely, they started to look more like metal. Even the water shows just how much rust was on them, and they're still not even close to perfect.
So these are obviously the stock headers, but they make the stock headers on my R1 look like art. These are thin and ugly, and they just look cheaply made. I thought that they would look identical to my R1, but it looks like Honda was more concerned with how much they cost to make than the airflow, which is interesting and disappointing. After all, these two bikes are the same generation essentially.
Nevertheless, I still wanted to give them one last dash of TLC with some Autosol metal polish and steel wool, which worked wonders on the cat area that I'd given up on earlier. Just because the inside of it looks abused doesn't mean the outside has to, and I think that's as much rust and oil as I'm going to get off the exhaust.
Now, while I'm on a roll, I'd like to get this damaged swing arm off as well. That's another reason why I wanted the exhaust off, because I think it's going to make getting to all the bolts a little bit easier. But this is another thing that I have never done before, so I'm going to have to figure out the best order to do things as I go.
Since the chain goes through the swing arm, I decided to remove it first by cutting off the head of the pins. obviously while wearing FIM approved protection, and then tapping out the pins completely with a center punch so a link can be removed. Then it was out with the rear wheel, which is a much more pleasant job without a chain. I also removed the rear mudguard, somewhat out of procrastination and somewhat so I could see better, but then it was time to take the weight off the swing arm. I jacked up the rear of the bike under the linkage and played around with a few jack stand positions before settling on the sturdiest one, so I could let the jack down and remove the paddock stand, rendering the swing arm useless. There are also a few bolts mounting the brake line and wheel speed sensor to the swing arm that needs to be removed. Then I loosened off the bolts for the pivot, where the shock connects, and where the linkage connects. With the top shock bolt out, nothing really changed, so I moved on to the linkage bolt, which did get the swing arm to droop a bit, and finally I pulled out the pivot. The shock lowered, but the swing arm was still snagged on some brake lines, so I loosened off the rear set to make space, only to then find hoses routed through the swing arm, but eventually I did get it out completely. Originally, I planned to get this hole welded up, the spool threads repaired, and the whole thing powder coated.
Because remember, a brand new swing arm from Honda is $2,000, and that's in the US. Where I am, my experience so far has been that everything from Honda is double the price of US prices, and I'm not paying $4,000 for a swing arm. And luckily, I didn't have to, because this is a second-hand swing arm off of a 2017 model, so it's exactly the same. A very nice man reached out to me and told me that he had one of these just lying around from a project he had done, and he let me buy it for $150, so you know, a little bit less than $4 grand.
It does, however, also have signs of wear, and the spool threads on this one have been welded back on, but once I get it painted, it will look brand new.
And while I'm at it, I want to get the wheels done too.
Partly because I hate these CBR logos on the wheels, and it's not just a sticker, it's under the clear coat, and partly because these wheels are a nice design and black hides that, but mostly because the front wheel also has some curb rash from the crash that needs to be repaired.
And I found another issue with the front wheel when I got the tires removed.
It's very slight, but the front wheel has a small wobble to it from the impact.
And for all of that, the wheels need to be stripped, except for maybe the bearings so that they can spin the wheel to see if it's true. But besides that, it's all got to go.
The rear sprocket and cush drive are easy since it all just pulls out. And to my surprise, the disc bolts were very easy to loosen, as well as the ABS ring, which just left the valve stems and wheel weights to be removed. The front wheel was the same process: ABS ring, disc number 1, disc number 2, valve stem, and wheel weights. And now it's all ready for paint.
A couple of you guys also educated me on how oil got into my cylinders in the first place. This is a 4-stroke piston. So this top ring is called a compression ring, and this bigger bottom ring is an oil ring. Both of these rings have gaps in them called the end gap. So if a bike were to lie on its side or upside down for long enough, oil could seep through this gap and into your cylinders. This was actually the theory that my dad thought was most likely. But the problem that I had with it was that surely if this was the case, as soon as you put the bike back on its wheels, back upright, wouldn't the oil flow back the way it came? And this was what one of you guys cleared up for me. Say for example, the end gap is pointing to the right-hand side of the bike. So even if you were to stand the bike upright on its wheels, on its kickstand, if it is on its kickstand, it'll still be leaning to the left. So now the highest point of the piston is the right-hand side here, which is where the end gap is. So oil can still pool below this level and not seep out through the end gap again, even though the bike is upright. Simple once explained. And this also explains why my airbox wasn't super oily. It didn't take the route I thought it did. And it's something to be aware of if you ever crash your bike. But anyway, the good news is that now we should be done stripping the bike down of everything that's broken. So in the next video, we can start building it back up.